what's going on, guys? It's me, Train Man, and welcome back to the Zombie Train, episode 174? 174. Anyways, we're about to run out of topics, I gotta say, so if you have any ideas for things that you want me to talk about regarding the Zombie Train and the things that go on in that universe, put it down in the comments and I'll make an episode about it. Alright. Anyways, so a little while ago, a few weeks ago, O'Gillies asked me what went on in Salt Lake City, and I know this is close to his heart because it's close to home for him. So, like a lot of the Western, or like a lot of cities in general, it was of course kind of swamped from the beginning. You'd get a few cases, every city or town that was infected had their case zero, and, unless the zombie came as a zombie from elsewhere. Which was the case in a lot of towns that lasted a little bit longer. Actually, before I talk about this, this episode we work on this area. It's the Honor Peak base station. I don't actually have a station for it yet because Trains was being a dickbag, and yeah, we don't have a station for it yet. But I'm setting up a scene because I need to use this area for something in the first episode, which is coming out on Saturday. I won't say we're ahead of schedule, but we're definitely going to make it on time. Anyways, so I work on this area, and also we learn Scary Yoshi's a mad genius, but I'll point that out when we get there. Alright, anyways, unless I'm distracted. Anyways, so Salt Lake City, being first densely populated area and then suburbia that it is, it did not take long for the city to be overtaken. And it's fairly separated. It was one of the places that tried to be held down initially, but the expanses around it meant that the zombies, if they wandered off, they could group up and then come back as very large and significant waves, which didn't make things easy. A lot of zombies in an open area is possibly more dangerous than a lot of zombies in a closed area, because in a closed area, if there are a lot of Zacks, you're going to be on your toes. And that's not necessarily true, or if and when, if you have a small number of zombies in enclosed areas, because you think you get all of them. Whereas, you always stay on your toes with a lot. Anyways, that's kind of irrelevant right here. What we're talking about, in SLC, there were a number of holdouts, but most of them the survivors, they ended up migrating I believe they ended up going south of the city. There may have been two camps, one north and one south, and one was evacuated. I believe the southern one was evacuated to the west coast, and then eventually brought back when the military was retaking the city, but that was a while out. That was during the offensive, that was during the pushback after, basically after we'd established a little bit more of a foothold, after not after ZT Inc. was a thing, but right around the time that happened, because they had originally considered using Salt Lake City when they got there as a sort of forward staging area to work out, or to take on the Great Plains area, because there are a lot of Zacks out there. But it wasn't prudent. They ended up moving in the end. They didn't keep a lot at Salt Lake. Anyways, the thing that's worth noting is that Salt Lake City did do a lot better than comparable cities of the same size because of its geography. It did not have to worry about incursions from Zacks from other cities, for the most part. It had a fairly significant population that became zombified, but it was the kind of thing where if you got the hell out of Dodge, you didn't have to worry about the stuff that was in there, and they, the two groups, they only had to worry about the zombies that were immediately from the area. And this made things a little bit easier for them, but it didn't quite make it easy enough, and when the military got to them, it was, okay, we're going to try to evacuate you. The South group, they got evacuated successfully, because it was easier to do that than it was to bring them all sorts of supplies at that point, because the ZT Inc. wasn't a thing yet. And the North group, I believe they tried to get to them, but in between them finding out about them and then getting to them, that group was largely wiped out. You'd think the activity in the south would have attracted the zombies, and it did to an extent, but it also attracted a lot of the people to the north, because originally they didn't realize that the military knew that they were there, and that they were going to come to them eventually. And, some would argue that they just didn't get there fast enough, and they should have gotten them both in one fell swoop, which is the argument of a lot of a lot of historians saying, this loss of several thousand lives could have been avoided, and this was a thriving community. They were both fairly thriving communities that had managed to hold out on their own. I don't know if they ever had any sort of commerce, but, that sort of thing, you'd have to ask a survivor of South, because I'm not sure there are too many of North. So, Salt Lake City South got evacuated. Salt Lake City North, they had sort of a breakdown of politics in Salt Lake City North, where a lot of them wanted to just make the run through the city to the south, and get evacuated with South. Unfortunately, that turned out to be death in a lot of cases for the groups or individuals that tried to make it across town. It simply wasn't. It was not safe. It was not possible. And by Salt Lake City, I don't mean the city itself. I mean the city and its outlying regions. That the sort of whole megalopolis of the different towns and cities around Salt Lake City in that whole, because Salt Lake City is a very isolated area. It's got, itself, and then the suburbs to the north, and it's got Ogden bundled in with it as well, and the other towns around there. Again, it was, fairly well-to-do, but fairly isolated, which helped it immensely. So, the North then lost a large, group of its personnel, and in the chaos, they ended up drawing a bunch of Zaks to them, and that was the end of North. By the time the military got there, the complex was empty, needless to say. It was gone, pretty much. Yeah, so I brought up a map. The South group was more or less in Provo, and the North group was, whoa, my map just went nuts. The North group was somewhere between Ogden and Layton. There's an open area there. Oh, it's an airfield. Yeah, it was at this airfield. Oh, it was an Air Force base. Yeah, that makes sense then. Unfortunately, the military didn't. They either didn't have the capability or they didn't have the thoughtfulness, because they were bringing in planes at Tuile, or however you pronounce that, and using the railroad to get from there into town, because that area is basically far enough out of the way that they didn't have to worry about anything. They didn't want to go to the Air Force Base. They didn't know what the conditions of it were. And, of course, the Air Force Base, I don't know if they had power, but if they did, they weren't able to make any sort of long-distance contact. I didn't know about them. Or else I would have, I probably would have made an attempt. Because I was out there around the same time that they were pushing for it. I was going out to Portland to get 3254 worked on. That's a little bit of that is detailed in the past, and that turned into, again, the Battle of Portland, which I've talked about a little bit. So Salt Lake City was, it was, you could say that especially towards the middle of the war, everything was going much better than expected. For a comparable city of its size, if it had been in a more open area, the population likely would have been almost completely wiped out, sort of without question. But you had these two groups, each with several thousand survivors each, and they managed to, perhaps not thrive, but survive in the area until the military intervention saved one of them and indirectly doomed the other one. And now eventually they came back in there and they revitalized it, because they had to clear the city, of course, because that was just part of what you were doing. You don't leave zombies around. And, while they were pushing for Denver then, and, they thought they thought Salt Lake would be a very good jumping off point again for fighting eastward from there, but they decided upon Denver in the end. And so they had to run, they eventually took Denver, and that's where they started their conquest of the Great Plains states, out of Colorado and out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. But even though Cheyenne, Wyoming was not in a good place at all. Like, Cheyenne being at the edge of the Great Plains and not having, they didn't have massive population, so they didn't have the internal breakdown as quickly. It didn't quite go as quickly, but they got swamped. They got absolutely swamped. And Denver was big enough that it was just kind of in trouble from the beginning. A lot of people that survived from Denver ended up going out into the woods, or into the woods and the mountains, and sort of living on their own, trying to make do with what they had. And those kind of states, you get a lot of people who are very capable, but at the same time you get a lot of people who think they're very capable and really have no idea what they're doing and end up dying out there. The same goes for all the people who headed north. Most of them did not survive. Not even close. So that's that, And again, Salt Lake was a stepping stone towards Denver, and then Salt Lake itself, it became sort of a hub, but not as big of one as it ever had been. It was sort of like, well, what is the practical upshot to staking out Salt Lake City right now? Or, in general, it became a stop, but it did not become really anything. There wasn't a mass amount of production going on there from that point on. There wasn't a massive amount of really anything. You could get salt out of there, but you only need so much salt. That causeway proved to be a bastard to fix. Not fix, but to keep up to snuff. We ended up using it a hell of a lot, though. The salt flats, they proved to definitely be one of the easiest routes to get from point A to point B. Just, think about it, it's straight. It's dead straight. There's not much better you can get than that. So yeah, it was an important transportation hub come Zombie Train Inc., but it was not really anything more than a transportation hub. Especially after the two groups fell. Or, the two groups ceased to exist, you might say. I don't really know what else to say. It's not a, it's not a huge, it's not a huge note in history. And I don't know the dynamics of those two groups. Again, I couldn't really speculate. I don't know who survived from North. I know it is around locations that I do know people, so there may have been someone I knew in North. Probably not in South, but, potentially in North, but they likely didn't survive past, past the military showing up, which I don't know when that was exactly. It was a November. It was one of those Novembers. Hold on, let me draw up my notes on this. Because I do have a little bit, I do keep track a little bit of where I was and when. But then again, this isn't precisely accurate. Crossing Rose Pass, that was in 2014, so somewhere between, somewhere between, around there, within a few months, I think. It was either, I don't know if it was before or after. But I like to think it was after, because I like to think that I would have been able to make it. Oh, I wasn't able to point out Scaryoshi's genius, but if you're paying attention, this whole bridge setup, holy good God, dude, you're awesome. You should have gotten style points for this. Anyways, that is, yeah, I like to think it was before, because if it had been after, that means I might have been able to make it if I'd gone a different way. And that just makes me feel bad. But anyways, keep asking questions. I'll keep answering them. Hope you guys enjoyed. Trainman out.